Hi, I'm Mina.
And I'm Yules.
Thanks for tuning in to Artificially Informed.
Welcome to today's deep dive.
Hmm.
I am so glad you decided to join us for this because the collection of reporting we're looking at today is just, well, it's staggering in its scope.
It really is. It's a massive amount of ground to cover.
Yeah, we are basically taking a journey through a world of absolute extremes today. We'll be navigating everything from breathtaking cosmic light shows painting the night sky to the unearthing of colossal ancient beasts.
Right. The mammoth story.
Exactly, the mammoths, all the way to the very real, very intense geopolitical and economic shockwaves that are fundamentally reshaping the globe right this minute. It's a lot.
It's a profound stack of information to sift through. And what's fascinating here is how these seemingly entirely disparate events, a solar flare millions of miles away, an ancient bone in the dirt in Washington state in the United States, a fluctuating number on a global stock ticker, they all highlight the same underlying reality.
Which is?
They show us the incredible fragility, but also the remarkable resilience of both our natural ecosystems and the human-made systems we rely on every single day.
I love that. That concept of fragility and resilience, that is going to be our compass today. We're going to extract the most critical insights from today's global news outlets, cut through the noise, and give you the shortcut to being the most well-informed person in the room.
No overwhelm, just the deep context you need.
Right, exactly. Sitting here looking at this roadmap, I feel like we just need to buckle up.
Well, I have my notes highlighted. I've cross-referenced the timelines across our various reports, and I'm ready to jump in.
Awesome. Let's start with something that literally requires you to look up. Right now, the aurora borealis, the northern lights, are peaking.
Peaking in a big way.
Yeah. According to reports in the Washington Post, we're looking at the best viewing conditions we've had in nearly a decade. And this isn't just an event for people living up in the Arctic Circle. The lights are visible in at least 12 different states across the United States.
Which is incredibly rare for those latitudes.
It is. I know we see photos of this all the time, but what's actually happening on a cosmic level to make this visible so far south?
To understand that, we have to look at the mechanics of our local star. The sun operates on roughly an 11-year cycle of magnetic activity. And we are currently hitting the absolute peak of that cycle, which astrophysicists call the solar maximum.
Okay, the solar maximum.
Right. During a solar maximum, the sun's magnetic field becomes incredibly complex. It twists, it tangles, and that tension eventually snaps, leading to a massive increase in solar activity. Specifically, we're talking about solar flares and coronal mass ejections.
Those coronal mass ejections, they're essentially just giant clouds of plasma, right?
Exactly. Think of a coronal mass ejection as billions of tons of plasma and embedded magnetic field being violently hurled out into space from the sun's outer atmosphere, which is the corona.
Wow.
Yeah, and these actions travel at millions of miles per hour. When that wave of charged particles crosses the void of space and slams into the magnetic field surrounding the Earth, our magnetosphere, it creates a geomagnetic storm.
So our magnetic field takes the hit.
It does. The Earth's magnetic field acts like a shield, but it also funnels a large portion of those highly charged particles down toward the north and south magnetic poles.
And when they hit our atmosphere, they collide with the gases we breathe.
The visual spectacle is entirely driven by those collisions. The charged particles from the sun strike atoms and molecules in our upper atmosphere, primarily oxygen and nitrogen.
Right.
That collision transfers energy to the Earth's atmospheric gases, exciting them. As those gases calm back down to their normal state, they release that excess energy in the form of photons, or light.
That's where the colors come from.
Precisely. Oxygen at lower altitudes gives off that classic, shimmering neon green color, while oxygen much higher up can produce deep, rare reds.
Huh?
And the nitrogen collisions, those are responsible for the vibrant purples and blues dancing across the sky.
That is just so cool. If you are listening to this and you're in the United States, particularly in the Northeast or the Midwest regions, you really need to step outside tonight. Look away from the city lights. Let your eyes adjust. It's a breathtaking reminder of the sheer scale of the universe we're sitting in.
It really is.
But, while the upper atmosphere is giving us this incredible light show, the lower atmosphere is currently offering something much more chaotic.
The contrast is stark. Space weather is generating beauty, but our terrestrial weather is destabilizing in ways that are deeply dangerous for millions of people.
Let's get into the meteorology of this, because we're tracking a polar vortex split. ABC News is reporting this threatens to bring brutal, single-digit temperatures to the northeastern United States, specifically hitting places like New York.
It's a very serious weather event.
I hear polar vortex thrown around every winter, but a split sounds significantly worse. What are the fluid dynamics behind that?
A polar vortex split is a major meteorological disruption. The polar vortex is essentially a massive, three-dimensional area of low pressure and incredibly cold air that continuously swirls around the Earth's poles in the stratosphere.
High up.
Very high up. A strong, stable polar vortex acts like a fence. It keeps that bitter Arctic air locked tightly up north. However, the vortex is influenced by the jet stream down in the troposphere, which is the layer of the atmosphere where we actually live and where weather happens.
So the jet stream starts to wobble, the fence breaks down.
That's exactly it. When we see sudden stratospheric warming events, rapid spikes in temperature high above the Arctic, it destabilizes that swirling mass of cold air. The vortex weakens, its shape elongates, and in extreme cases like we're seeing right now, it actually splits into two or more smaller vortices.
And then the cold air escapes.
Right. When that containment system fails, the dense, freezing Arctic air has nowhere to go but south. It meanders deep into the mid-latitudes, plunging regions that are typically temperate into deep, dangerous freezes.
And the knock-on effects are devastating. Because while New York in the United States is bracing for a deep freeze, central states like Indiana and Ohio are dealing with the aftermath of massive destruction from severe tornado outbreaks.
That geographic contrast really highlights how interconnected and energetic the atmospheric system has become. You have a massive intrusion of frigid, dry Arctic air slamming into warm, moist air coming up from the Gulf of Mexico.
A recipe for disaster.
It's the exact engine required to produce violent, rotating supercell thunderstorms.
And these extremes, they don't stop at the borders of the United States. We're seeing infrastructure fail under the weight of this volatile weather globally. In Indonesia, over in Southeast Asia, heavy overnight rains triggered a catastrophic collapse at the country's largest landfill.
Just an awful situation.
We're talking about an avalanche of garbage and waste. At least 5 people have been killed, and several others are still missing, as of the latest reports.
The tragedy in Indonesia underscores a critical point about climate resilience. When we talk about extreme weather, we often focus on the event itself, the tornado, the freeze, the deluge of rain.
Right, the immediate spectacle.
But the actual human cost is usually dictated by the infrastructure that weather impacts. A landfill of that magnitude is a heavily engineered structure. It relies on specific drainage and soil stability parameters.
So when you get way more rain than usual.
Exactly. When you introduce unprecedented concentrated rainfall, the structural integrity of that waste mound fails catastrophically. It's a localized tragedy that points to a global vulnerability. Our civil engineering was built for a climate baseline that just no longer exists.
That idea of a disappearing baseline brings us to perhaps the most sobering extreme in this segment, which is Antarctica. The data coming out of these climate reports is frankly difficult to wrap your head around.
It is staggering.
Over the last 30 years, Antarctica has lost an area of ice that's 10 times the size of Los Angeles, California in the United States. We're talking about over 5,000 square miles of ice just completely gone.
The sheer volume of that loss is monumental, but glaciologists are even more concerned about the specific location of that melting. Satellite imagery and historical data confirm that one critical glacier has receded 42 kilometers over that time frame.
I am trying to picture what a 42-kilometer recession actually means for the structural integrity of the continent.
Let's use an analogy here. Imagine you have a massive chest freezer packed full of ice, and you accidentally leave the door just a tiny bit cracked open.
Okay.
For a day or two, you might not notice much of a change. The ice on the very edge might soften, but if you leave it cracked for 30 years, the ambient heat deeply infiltrates, and the structural integrity of everything inside is compromised. That receding glacier is the equivalent of leaving the freezer door open.
Because the glaciers on the edge act as the physical barrier for everything behind them.
They do. In glaciology, they're called ice shelves or buttressing glaciers. They act as a cork in a bottle, using friction against the bedrock to hold back the unimaginably vast rivers of inland ice.
So the cork pops.
When you remove that 42-kilometer stretch of coastal ice, you effectively remove the brakes. The inland ice begins to flow much more rapidly into the ocean, accelerating global sea level rise and dumping massive amounts of fresh water into the marine environment, which in turn disrupts global ocean currents.
It's a cascading failure. But as the climate changes and the ice recedes, there is a fascinating secondary effect. The shifting of the Earth and the melting of the permafrost are revealing things that have been hidden for millennia.
Uncovering the past.
Exactly, which pivots us perfectly into our next segment. We are moving from the extremes of weather to the giants of the past and present.
The thawing of the cryosphere is turning out to be one of the most productive, albeit concerning, engines for paleontological and archaeological discovery.
And I have to admit, I am completely geeking out over this first story. Archaeologists at the McBones Coyote Canyon Mammoth Site in eastern Washington state, in the United States, are currently excavating a prehistoric Ice Age mammoth.
It's an incredible find.
And they're actually offering public tours of the active dig site. I mean, the enthusiasm is just contagious.
The enthusiasm is entirely justified. Discoveries of this magnitude are incredibly valuable. When paleontologists unearth a mammoth from the Pleistocene epoch, they aren't just finding a skeleton, they're uncovering an incredibly detailed time capsule.
Just the visual of these giant shaggy beasts roaming around North America is pure magic to me. What specific data do researchers actually pull from a dig site like Coyote Canyon?
The data extraction is meticulous. By analyzing the mammoth's bones and teeth, scientists can determine its age, its diet, and even the specific season in which it died.
Wow, down to the season.
Yes, but the sediment surrounding the bones is equally important. They analyze microscopic pollen grains, plant macrofossils, and the remains of small invertebrates trapped in the dirt.
So they rebuild the world it lived in.
They reconstruct the entire ancient ecosystem. They can determine the exact climate, the flora, and the fauna of eastern Washington state tens of thousands of years ago. It helps us understand how these massive creatures interacted with their environment, how they adapted to climatic shifts, and ultimately it provides crucial clues into the extinction event that wiped out the Pleistocene megafauna.
It gives us a window into a world that existed long before human industrialization. But we don't just have giants in the past. We have some living right now, and the biology here is wild.
Oh, this next one is quite something.
Get ready for this. A newly measured python, affectionately nicknamed the Baroness, has clocked in at an astonishing 23.5 feet long. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
I'm generally a fan of animals, but a snake that is longer than two great white sharks placed end to end, that is absolutely where I draw the line.
It's certainly an intimidating visual. I wouldn't want to bump into it. But biologically, the Baroness is a marvel. This highlights a fundamental difference between mammalian and reptilian physiology. Well, unlike humans and other mammals, which generally have a genetically predetermined growth cap and stop growing once they reach adulthood, many reptiles exhibit what is known as indeterminate growth.
Meaning there is no biological off switch for their size.
Essentially, yes. As long as a large constrictor like this python has access to an abundant and consistent food supply, a suitable environment, and manages to avoid disease or apex predators, it can continue to grow throughout its entire lifespan.
So it just keeps going.
The growth rate slows down significantly as they age, of course, but a specimen reaching 23.5 feet indicates an animal that has thrived in its ecosystem for a very long time, outliving, outcompeting, and outgrowing its peers.
Well, I'm glad she is thriving, preferably very, very far away from me. But speaking of things that captivate our attention and sometimes send a shiver down your spine, our news outlets today highlighted two massive historical mysteries that are back in the headlines.
The Dyatlov Pass update is particularly interesting.
Right. First, new research into the 1959 Dyatlov Pass incident. For those who aren't familiar, this is one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. 9 experienced hikers were found dead in the Ural Mountains of Russia.
A case that has baffled people for decades.
The details are notoriously grim. Their tents were torn open from the inside, their bodies were found frozen in the snow, some in various states of undress, some with inexplicable massive internal injuries, crushed chests, fractured skulls without any external trauma, missing eyes, a missing tongue. Now, new research is pointing to potential Cold War military involvement.
The Dyatlov Pass case has generated dozens of theories over the decades, ranging from a localized avalanche to infrasound-induced panic. However, this new research pivoting toward Cold War military involvement introduces a very compelling forensic angle.
What's the specific theory?
During the late 1950s, the Ural Mountains were a known testing ground for classified Soviet weaponry. The theory suggests the hikers may have inadvertently camped in the drop zone of a parachute mine testing exercise.
A parachute mine.
Yes. Parachute mines detonate above the ground, creating massive concussive shock waves. That kind of aerial blast causes severe internal trauma, like crushed ribs and skulls, without leaving shrapnel or external wounds.
Which perfectly aligns with the autopsy.
Exactly. It aligns with the autopsies of victims like Ludmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov.
That is horrifying, but it makes an incredible amount of forensic sense. Meanwhile, in Bradford, in the United Kingdom, local officials are looking to turn the grave of a man known as Humbug Billy into a tourist attraction. This is a wildly different kind of mystery.
A much older, more localized tragedy.
Right. Humbug Billy was a man who accidentally killed 21 people and poisoned over 200 others in the 1850s.
The 1858 Bradford sweet poisoning is a tragic case study in Victorian supply chains. William Hardacre, known as Humbug Billy, sold peppermint humbugs in the local market. To cut costs, sweet makers at the time would substitute some of the sugar with a powdered substance known as daft. Yes, which was typically plaster of Paris or calcium sulfate, just a cheap filler. However, due to a catastrophic mix-up at the pharmacist where the daft was purchased, the sweet maker was accidentally sold 12 pounds of arsenic trioxide instead.
It's an unbelievable tragedy born out of sheer negligence. But it raises a really interesting sociological point. Why are local officials turning this grave into an attraction? Why are we so obsessed with visiting the grave of a Victorian poisoner or obsessing over a frozen mountain pass in Russia?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's a fascinating look at the psychology of dark tourism. We have a deep-seated fascination with the macabre for several reasons. Psychologically, it offers a safe environment to confront our own mortality and vulnerabilities.
Like watching a scary movie, but real.
Exactly. By exploring these dark, unsolved mysteries, we can process fear and tragedy from a comfortable distance. There is also a powerful narrative element at play. The human brain is evolutionarily wired to seek patterns, resolve inconsistencies, and solve puzzles.
And these open cases drive us crazy.
An unsolved mystery like the Dyatlov Pass is essentially a massive, open cognitive loop that our minds desperately want to close. Furthermore, dark tourism often serves a commemorative function. Visiting sites associated with tragedy is a way for society to memorialize victims and ensure that history, especially its darker chapters regarding negligence or state secrets, isn't forgotten.
We really do love trying to decode the past. But as we move into our next segment, we're seeing how the desire to decode mysteries isn't just about history. It's about the modern mysteries of the human body and the cutting-edge technology we're building to solve them.
The advancements we're seeing in medical imaging and machine learning are fundamentally altering the landscape of preventative medicine.
This first piece of tech news from the Washington Post is staggering. Groundbreaking research has revealed that routine breast cancer screenings, mammograms, can now utilize AI, or artificial intelligence, to detect signs of cardiovascular disease.
It's a huge leap forward.
I'm looking at these reports, and the correlation they found is incredible. How does the AI actually distinguish between a benign issue and a cardiovascular red flag on a scan meant for breast tissue?
To understand that, we have to look at how convolutional neural networks process radiological data. What the AI is specifically trained to identify is breast arterial calcification, or BAC.
Calcification in the arteries.
Right. These are distinct calcium deposits that build up in the arteries of the breast. Radiologists have known for a long time that these calcifications exist, but historically, they were considered benign in the context of breast cancer, so they weren't the primary focus of the screening.
So the human doctors were looking for tumors, and understandably ignoring the calcium in the arteries.
Exactly. However, large-scale medical research has established a strong, independent correlation between the presence and severity of these specific calcifications in the breast and a significantly higher risk of systemic cardiovascular disease, which includes heart attacks and strokes.
And the AI can spot them better.
The AI model is trained on tens of thousands of mammograms, cross-referenced with the patient's cardiac histories. It learns to recognize the microscopic, highly specific patterns of BAC that the human eye might overlook or dismiss because they are so focused on oncology.
So an algorithm can look at an X-ray taken to find cancer and spot the hidden warning signs for a heart attack before it happens.
That is the immense value of dual-purpose medical screenings. We already have a massive infrastructure in place encouraging women to get regular mammograms. Now, without requiring the patient to undergo an additional procedure, spend more money, endure more radiation, or take more time out of their schedule, the AI can perform a secondary life-saving analysis.
It's just a software upgrade to an existing process.
Precisely. It's utilizing existing data to exponentially increase the preventative power of a single doctor's visit.
Think about how many lives could be saved by that kind of efficiency. I want you to just let that sink in. It is technology actively making the world a better, safer place. But as we shift our focus to the hardware that actually runs these massive AI models, we see a much more complicated, fragile picture regarding consumer technology and global supply chains.
The software is advancing rapidly, but the physical reality of manufacturing the hardware required to run it is currently sitting on a razor's edge.
On the consumer side, the demand is just insatiable. Bloomberg is reporting that following the launch of the MacBook Neo, Apple is aggressively expanding its high-end Ultra product line.
Consumers want the best tech available.
Yeah, there are strong rumors circulating about a touchscreen MacBook Ultra coming down the pipeline. People want faster, more powerful, more capable machines to handle these AI integrations. But concurrently, Reuters is reporting that China is issuing stark warnings about a looming global semiconductor shortage. We've been through chip shortages before.
Yeah.
What is triggering the alarm bells this time around?
This impending shortage is deeply tied to a complex, escalating dispute over the semiconductor company Nexperia, which is partially owned by China's Wingtech technology.
Okay, Nexperia.
The semiconductor supply chain is arguably the most complex and fragile manufacturing ecosystem on the planet. The production of advanced microchips isn't handled in a single factory. It requires a globally integrated network.
It crosses borders constantly.
You need specialized raw materials, incredibly complex lithography equipment, often produced by only one or two companies in the world, like ASML in the Netherlands, and extremely precise fabrication plants, or fabs, located primarily in Taiwan, South Korea, and the US.
So if a dispute over ownership or export controls hits a company like Nexperia, it's not just an isolated corporate issue.
Not at all. It acts as a choke point. Semiconductors are the foundational brains of modern existence. They dictate everything.
So if this dispute boils over and the chip shortage hits hard, what does the cascading effect look like? Because it's not just about waiting an extra month for a new MacBook.
The ripple effects are immediate and severe across multiple industries. If a severe shortage hits, automotive manufacturers have to halt entire assembly lines. Modern vehicles require thousands of specialized legacy chips for everything from engine timing to seat motors.
Right, cars are basically computers on wheels now.
It also impacts the production of medical devices, including the very machines running those AI mammogram diagnostics we just talked about. It delays home appliances, industrial machinery, and agricultural equipment. The global economy relies entirely on the seamless, uninterrupted flow of these tiny silicon wafers. When geopolitical or corporate disputes interrupt that flow, it causes massive economic stagnation.
Which is a heavy but vital bridge into our next segment. Because fragile global supply chains are just one piece of the puzzle. We are now moving into the geopolitical and economic nexus. And I want to pause here and be very clear with you. The news in this section is globally significant, it's moving fast, and it is highly politically charged.
Very much so.
Our goal right now isn't to take a side, but to impartially break down the facts of these global events, examine the arguments from all perspectives, and understand how they're sending shockwaves around the world.
That objective, journalistic approach is essential. The global geopolitical landscape is currently undergoing severe, simultaneous stress tests on multiple fronts, and the implications are profound.
Let's start with the rapidly deteriorating situation in the Middle East. According to extensive reporting from the BBC, Al Jazeera, and the Financial Times, the war involving Israel, Iran, and Lebanon is now entering its second week, and the escalation is aggressive.
The scope of the conflict is widening daily.
Israel has significantly expanded its operational scope. They're now conducting strikes on Iranian oil storage facilities, as well as targeting specific locations in Beirut, Lebanon, and the Iranian capital, Tehran.
The strategic shift to targeting Iranian oil infrastructure represents a critical escalation in the conflict. It moves the theater of operations from purely military or proxy targets into the realm of direct economic warfare.
Going after the wallet.
Exactly. Oil exports are the lifeblood of the Iranian economy. By striking oil storage and export terminals, Israel is attempting to cripple Iran's primary source of sovereign revenue. The strategic objective is to limit Tehran's financial capacity to fund its own military operations and to cut off the capital flowing to its allied proxy groups across the region, often referred to as the axis of resistance.
And the human cost of these escalating operations is mounting rapidly. Beyond the airstrikes, there are reports that Israeli special forces conducted a highly complex overnight raid in a Lebanese village.
A very dangerous ground operation.
The stated objective was reportedly to search for the 40-year-old remains of a missing Israeli soldier, likely dating back to the First Lebanon War in the early 1980s. However, the raid resulted in heavy kinetic engagement, and at least 41 people were killed.
That specific operation is a devastating reflection of how deep historical grievances and the relentless pursuit of long-standing national objectives can ignite immediate, tragic violence in the present. The recovery of fallen personnel is a deeply embedded cultural and military imperative for Israel. But executing that objective deep within sovereign Lebanese territory inevitably leads to severe casualties and further regional destabilization.
The rhetoric from global leaders is matching the intensity on the ground. In the United States, President Donald Trump has publicly and forcefully demanded Iran's unconditional surrender. At the same time, the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, briefed the press, stating that the U.S. military anticipates these operations will last 4 to 6 weeks.
Analyzing those statements reveals a very specific geopolitical posture. President Trump's demand for unconditional surrender sets an uncompromising maximalist bar for any potential diplomatic resolution. Historically, unconditional surrender is rarely achieved outside of total multi-theater warfare.
And the 4 to 6 week timeline.
Concurrently, laying out a 4 to 6 week timeline from the White House indicates that the U.S. military apparatus is preparing for sustained, intensive engagement. It suggests intelligence assessments believe a quick de-escalation is highly unlikely, and they are preparing the American public and global markets for a prolonged period of instability.
Inside Iran, the political structure is also undergoing massive shifts in real time. Following recent events, Mojtaba Khamenei has been officially appointed as Iran's new supreme leader. However, the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, took a slightly different tone. In a televised public address, Pezeshkian stated that Iran will not attack neighboring countries unless provoked, emphasizing that Tehran respects regional sovereignty.
This presents a fascinating and complex dynamic within Iran's dual leadership structure. The supreme leader holds the ultimate, unquestionable authority in the country, particularly holding direct command over the armed forces, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and dictating all foreign policy.
So Mojtaba Khamenei holds the real power.
Mojtaba Khamenei's elevation ensures continuity of that absolute authority. However, President Pezeshkian's statements seem carefully calibrated to manage external optics. By emphasizing non-aggression toward neighbors, the civilian government is likely attempting to prevent a unified regional coalition, perhaps involving Gulf states, from forming against Iran.
A dual messaging strategy.
It's a calculated dual messaging strategy, projecting ideological strength and military readiness internally, while attempting to mitigate broader diplomatic fallout with immediate neighbors.
The alliances shaping this conflict are stretching far beyond the Middle East, too. We're seeing modern warfare tactics being exported in real time. There are confirmed reports that Ukraine is sending anti-drone technology experts to the Middle East to share their specialized knowledge.
That development is a stark indicator of how deeply interconnected modern conflicts have become. Over the past few years, Ukraine has been forced to develop incredibly sophisticated electronic warfare and kinetic countermeasures against loitering munitions and drone swarms.
They have firsthand experience.
By actively exporting that hard-won expertise to the Middle East, we see how the technological lessons learned on the battlefield in Eastern Europe are immediately transferred to influence the balance of power and defense capabilities in another hemisphere.
But the intelligence sharing goes both ways, and it's highly dangerous. The Washington Post and AP News are reporting that Russian intelligence agencies are actively providing critical, real-time information to Iran. This intelligence is specifically aimed at helping Tehran target U.S. military forces in the region, including warships and aircraft.
Intelligence sharing of that caliber represents a massive shift in the global balance of power. It indicates that Russia is moving beyond political alliance and actively working to bolster Iran's operational kinetic capabilities against American assets.
Why would Russia risk that direct involvement?
It's a calculated strategic move by Moscow. By bogging down U.S. military resources and focus in the Middle East, Russia likely aims to alleviate pressure on its own fronts while simultaneously securing a vital, deeply indebted ally in Tehran.
So what does this all mean for the U.S. response? Well, the reporting suggests massive rapid shifts in posture. The U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division suddenly canceled a major, long-planned training exercise. This has fueled intense speculation that a rapid response troop deployment to the Middle East is imminent. We are talking about a division that serves as the tip of the spear, capable of being fully mobilized and globally deployed within 18 hours.
The cancellation of a division-level exercise by the 82nd Airborne is never a coincidence. It signals an immediate elevation in readiness protocols. When you look at the entirety of the shifting global alliances, the coordination between the US and Israel, the intelligence pact between Russia and Iran, the technological involvement of Ukrainian experts, we are witnessing a highly complex, incredibly high-stakes geopolitical chess match.
Moving pieces on a board.
Every movement of troops, every canceled exercise, every shared piece of intelligence is a calculated move on a board that spans multiple continents.
And the consequences of that chess match aren't isolated to military bases or situation rooms. It is hitting the global economy like a sledgehammer. The geopolitical instability, particularly the direct Israeli strikes on Iranian oil facilities, has caused global energy markets to panic. We're looking at Brent crude oil prices surging past $100 a barrel, which is the highest mark we've seen since 2022.
This is exactly where the grand geopolitical narrative becomes a deeply personal, immediate reality for the average person. The global economy is fundamentally reliant on stable, predictable energy prices. When a major producer's infrastructure is burning halfway across the world or vital shipping lanes are threatened, the commodity markets price in the risk of supply disruption immediately.
And the stock market absolutely hates that kind of volatility. Consequently, the U.S. stock market took a massive hit. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped roughly 450 to 600 points throughout the week. Financial analysts are calling it the worst week for the market in nearly a year. The situation is severe enough that the G7, the group of 7 nations, are currently holding emergency summit meetings to discuss tapping into global strategic oil reserves to try and calm the markets down.
The economic connection is instantaneous. A conflict thousands of miles away instantly dictates the price you pay for a gallon of gas down the street. That increased fuel cost dictates the cost of transporting freight and groceries to your local supermarket, which drives up retail food prices.
Everything gets more expensive.
That broad market panic immediately affects the valuation of companies in your retirement portfolio or 401k. When energy stability vanishes, it triggers widespread, cascading economic anxiety.
And that economic anxiety is compounding with some really tough domestic news in the United States. Amidst all this global chaos, the U.S. job market stumbled significantly. The latest labor reports show the U.S. economy lost 92,000 jobs in February, pushing the unemployment rate up to 4.4%.
A net loss of 92,000 jobs is a stark contraction, completely subverting economic forecasts that had predicted modest growth. It indicates a sudden cooling in corporate hiring, likely driven by the broader global uncertainty.
Naturally, the political response to these numbers has been immediate and intensely polarized. Looking at the political landscape, Democrats are pointing to these job losses and blaming President Trump's economic policies. They argue that the administration's tariff structures and deregulation efforts are failing to protect American workers and are causing long-term economic stagnation.
And the counterargument.
On the other side of the aisle, Republicans are actively defending the administration's overall economic record. They're pointing to broader, historical metrics of growth under the president, arguing that this specific jobs report is a temporary blip caused by external global factors rather than domestic policy failures.
The political framing is to be expected during an economic contraction. Both sides will interpret the data to support their broader narratives. However, if we strip away the partisan back and forth, what truly terrifies structural economists right now is the looming specter of stagflation.
Stagflation. I hear that word thrown around a lot when the economy looks shaky, usually referencing the 1970s. What exactly is the mechanism of stagflation?
Stagflation is essentially an economic perfect storm, a highly destructive paradox. It is the combination of stagnant economic growth, which we're clearly seeing reflected in the loss of 92,000 jobs and rising unemployment, combined with persistently high inflation.
Because usually those two things don't happen at the same time.
Correct. Traditional economic theory, like the Phillips curve, suggests an inverse relationship. If the economy slows down and unemployment rises, consumer spending drops, which usually causes inflation to fall.
Right.
Conversely, if inflation is high, it's usually because the economy is running hot and unemployment is low. Stagflation breaks those rules. You have the worst of both worlds. And what is driving the inflation side of the equation right now? The surging cost of oil from the Middle East conflict, which constitutes a massive supply-side shock, raising the base cost of everything.
So people are losing their jobs, their paychecks are vanishing, but the cost of keeping the lights on and buying groceries is simultaneously skyrocketing.
Exactly, and it leaves central banks like the Federal Reserve in an incredibly precarious position.
Oh,
They have very few effective tools to fix the problem without making one aspect worse.
a catch-22.
If they lower interest rates to stimulate job growth, they risk pouring fuel on the inflation fire. If they raise interest rates to crush inflation, they risk plunging the already stagnant economy into a deep recession and destroying even more jobs.
It is a brutal, suffocating squeeze on the average citizen. And when you have that level of economic stress combined with global pressures, it tends to dramatically exacerbate domestic political and legal dramas. Which brings us to our final segment, policy, security, and society. Again, our commitment here is to absolute journalistic neutrality. We are simply breaking down the facts of these complex societal issues as they're reported.
And the facts regarding our first topic in this segment carry immense legal and political weight.
They do. The DOJ, the Department of Justice, has released a massive cache of previously withheld documents related to the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. These documents include FBI, or Federal Bureau of Investigation, interview memos that contain specific sexual assault allegations against President Donald Trump.
This is a major release of information.
According to the official statement from the DOJ, these files were previously incorrectly coded as duplicative within their filing systems and were inadvertently withheld from publication and FOIA requests until now.
The release of these documents is highly significant on several intersecting levels. First, it reignites the intense public, legal, and media scrutiny surrounding the expansive network of powerful, high-profile individuals associated with Jeffrey Epstein.
It brings it all back into the spotlight.
But the timing and the subject of the release are equally notable. Releasing FBI documents containing serious allegations against a sitting president during a period of acute international conflict and domestic economic instability adds a dense, volatile layer of complexity to the American political environment. It speaks to a broader societal friction. We're witnessing a relentless public demand for absolute transparency and accountability regarding historical investigations, clashing with the highly polarized realities of modern political power.
It is a story that is going to dominate public discourse and legal analysis moving forward. Speaking of public discourse, and specifically how we legally mandate the recording and teaching of history, there's a massive cultural and legislative battle happening in the state of Virginia in the United States right now.
A very contentious new law.
The state legislature has passed a highly controversial new education law. This law explicitly prohibits public schools from teaching that the January 6th Capitol riot was a peaceful event. It legally mandates that the state curriculum teach the event specifically as a violent insurrection. Furthermore, the law strictly forbids educators from teaching or validating claims of widespread election fraud.
This legislation strikes at the heart of an incredibly important debate. This raises an important question. Who holds the authority to write the definitive, legally mandated version of history that is taught to the next generation?
It's the ultimate battle for the historical narrative playing out in state capitals. Let's look at the arguments surrounding this.
Proponents of the Virginia law argue forcefully that it is a necessary, protective step to ensure factual accuracy in the classroom. They argue it protects the integrity of historical education from deliberate political revisionism. From their perspective, teaching demonstrably false claims about election fraud or minimizing the violence of January 6 undermines the very foundations of civic education and democracy.
And the critics.
However, critics of the law view the legislation through the lens of government overreach and censorship. They argue that legislating curriculum in such a prescriptive, politically charged manner directly threatens academic freedom. They warn that it opens a dangerous door for state-mandated historical narratives that could suppress critical thinking, debate, and independent analysis by educators in the classroom. It's a profound, ongoing debate over the intersection of law, political ideology, and pedagogy.
We are watching the parameters of history being fought over in real time. But for our final story today, we are pivoting from the classroom to something that sounds like it was ripped straight out of a Hollywood spy thriller. Wow. I mean, reading the BBC report on this, it feels like a John le Carré novel, but this is happening in real life. A major, highly secure trial is currently underway at the Old Bailey in London in the United Kingdom.
A very concerning trial for national security.
UK immigration officers have been arrested and are standing trial for allegedly working as spies for Chinese authorities.
The operational details of the case are indeed cinematic, but the implications for Western national security infrastructure are incredibly severe.
The details are wild. These immigration officers allegedly forced entry into a flat, operating completely outside their legal bounds and jurisdictions. They were essentially acting as an enforcement arm or a hit squad for a foreign government on British soil. And to make the story even darker, one of the implicated officers involved in the espionage ring died mysteriously in May of 2024, shortly after being released on bail.
The mysterious death certainly adds a layer of deep intrigue, but the core intelligence issue here is a concept known as transnational repression.
Transnational repression, meaning an authoritarian country reaching across sovereign borders to enforce its political will.
Precisely. It is the systematic phenomenon where governments reach far beyond their own borders to silence, intimidate, coerce, or repatriate dissidents, journalists, or expatriates living in sovereign democratic nations. What makes this specific UK case so alarming is the methodology.
Because they didn't just send their own agents.
The Chinese intelligence apparatus didn't just deploy their own foreign agents to operate in the shadows. They allegedly infiltrated domestic British law enforcement. They subverted UK immigration officers, individuals explicitly entrusted with upholding British law and securing its borders, and turned them into active intelligence assets for the Chinese state.
It represents a massive breach of operational integrity.
It does. It highlights how aggressive and sophisticated foreign intelligence operations have become in infiltrating the fundamental institutions of Western democracies. It's a completely different kind of warfare. No missiles, no troop deployments, just quiet, corrosive subversion of the very people meant to protect the state. It forces intelligence agencies like MI5 to conduct a complete reevaluation of internal security protocols. How do you trust the integrity of your borders when foreign powers are actively compromising the officers guarding them?
It is a chilling thought. And honestly, it really brings this entire journey full circle. We started this deep dive looking up at the aurora borealis, marveling at the sheer scale of the universe and the solar flares painting the sky. And we ended looking at the invisible, shadowy networks of global espionage happening right in our own neighborhoods.
We have covered a vast, complex amount of ground today.
We really have. But that's the mission of this show. We've looked at how a magnetic storm millions of miles away creates a light show over our backyards. We've seen how a melting glacier in Antarctica acts as a ticking clock for coastal cities worldwide. We've explored how a prehistoric mammoth in Washington state and a 23-foot python remind us of the incredible shifting scale of life on Earth.
The extremes of the natural world.
Exactly. We've broken down how a machine learning algorithm can spot the hidden signs of heart disease, while a corporate dispute over microchips threatens to stall the entire global economy. And perhaps most heavily, we've unpacked how a barrel of oil, a shifting political alliance in the Middle East, and the deployment of troops are all deeply, intricately connected threads in the fabric of our daily lives.
As we synthesize all this reporting, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. If an algorithm can find the microscopic beginnings of heart disease hidden in a routine X-ray, and a sudden geopolitical shift in the Middle East can alter the price of nearly everything we buy overnight, how much of our daily lives is truly within our own control, and how much is quietly dictated by these invisible, infinitely interconnected global systems?
That is the question to mull over as you go about your day. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Our goal is always to help you navigate this complex world with a little more clarity and to give you the context behind the headlines. So stay insanely curious, keep questioning the world around you, and be sure to join us next time.
You're enjoying Artificially Informed.
Hit subscribe and share it with a friend.
From the left, the right, and straight from the algorithm.
Thank you.
Welcome to the debate. We're staring down a pretty intense period of global economic turbulence right now. I mean, anyone watching the Dow Jones Industrial Average over the last few days has seen these massive, incredibly volatile swings. We are talking about drops between 450 and 800 points in a single trading session, just wiping out billions in market capitalization almost instantly.
It is certainly not for the faint of heart. And, it's not just equities taking a brutal hit either. We are seeing these mounting, very credible fears of stagflation starting to grip the global economy, which, honestly, is arguably a much more terrifying prospect than a simple stock market correction.
Yeah, absolutely. Which brings us to the central question we are hashing out today. Are we looking at an economic crisis driven primarily by an unprecedented geopolitical shock, specifically the escalating conflict in the Middle East and those soaring energy prices, or, and this is the crux of it, Is this external crisis merely pulling the curtain back on pre-existing systemic weaknesses deeply embedded within the United States labor and capital markets?
Right. And this exact discussion comes directly from recent global news reports, where we just see this brutal collision of data points. We have a highly concerning U.S. jobs report, severe tech industry layoffs, and simultaneously a massive military escalation in the Middle East involving the United States, Israel, and Iran.
Exactly. So my stance today is that this crisis is fundamentally an external energy and geopolitical shock of historic proportions. The market is reacting entirely rationally to a supply chain threat that we just haven't seen in decades.
And I will be arguing that the geopolitical situation is merely the catalyst. It's an accelerant for a domestic economic foundation that was already fracturing from structural rot well before the first shots were fired.
Okay, let's just look at the physical reality of the energy markets right now, because the evidence from the physical supply side is just staggering. Oil prices have surged past $110 a barrel. We've got Brent crude, which is the major global price benchmark, jumping over 8% in a matter of days, and West Texas Intermediate, or WTI, the U.S. benchmark, is up over 11%.
Those are the highest levels we have seen since September 2023, by the way.
Right, exactly. And it is not just price speculation either. This is a hard, physical supply threat. We had Qatar's energy minister explicitly warning the international community that all oil production out of the Gulf region in the Middle East could stop within a matter of days if the military escalation widens. Furthermore, we are looking at a near-complete halt of commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is a massive logistical nightmare.
It is the ultimate maritime choke point. The Strait of Hormuz normally handles 20% of the world's total oil exports. Millions of barrels a day just stopped. I mean, global markets were actually relatively stable until the threat of a prolonged 4 to 6 week military operation became a real possibility. The realization that this specific conflict could push oil to $150 a barrel is what triggered these massive inflation fears. That is what drove the Dow to its worst week since April. The fundamental architecture of global energy is under attack, and the market is pricing in that exact external shock.
I hear the scale of what you are laying out. I really do. But I look at the exact same economic landscape and I see a completely different root cause. Yes, the geopolitical situation in the Gulf is highly volatile, but it is functioning purely as an accelerant for an economy that was already fundamentally weak.
You really believe the foundation was rotting before the escalation in March?
I absolutely do. The data shows it clearly if you look past the flashy daily headlines. Just look at the February jobs report. We saw a highly surprising and, frankly, deeply troubling loss of 92,000 jobs in the United States. The overall unemployment rate climbed to 4.4%, and crucially, those job losses happened in February. That is a full month before the Middle East conflict fully escalated in March.
But losing 92,000 jobs in a multi-trillion-dollar economy is a blip. It's not a structural collapse.
It is not just the top-line number, though. It is the trend, and it's the specific sector's bleeding capital. We have a tech sector in Silicon Valley, California, currently facing mass layoffs and a contraction that industry experts are warning hasn't been seen since 2008 and the dot-com bust. My core point is that a truly robust, structurally sound economy has the intrinsic resiliency to weather external commodity shocks. But an economy characterized by a shrinking labor force, struggling startups lacking capital funding, and high baseline inflation, that is an economy that was deeply vulnerable before a single barrel of oil was delayed in the Strait of Hormuz.
Let's dig into that timeline, though, because I really think you are looking at that February jobs report in a complete vacuum. You are essentially suggesting Wall Street's current panic is just some delayed reaction to a cooling domestic labor market.
I am. The United States economy shedding 92,000 jobs in February is a hard, undeniable domestic macroeconomic data point. It indicates that consumer demand and corporate hiring were already contracting. The conflict in the Middle East is just providing a highly convenient scapegoat for a structural stagnation that was already baked into the system. When institutional investors see a 4.4% unemployment rate, They are reacting to internal rot, not just foreign policy.
Look, I have to push back hard on that framing. Financial markets do not look backward at month-old data. They look forward. They are inherently forward-looking mechanisms designed to price in future risk. They do not simply react to a month-old jobs report with an abrupt, historic 800-point sell-off on a random Tuesday.
But macroeconomic weakness has to be priced in eventually. The market always catches up to reality.
Sure, but the timing of the drop is the absolute key to understanding the mechanism here. That 800-point drop in the Dow directly correlated with specific, real-time comments regarding the expansion of military targets in the Middle East. It correlated with the administration demanding unconditional surrender and the immediate, resulting spike in energy futures. I will absolutely acknowledge the February labor data was weak, but the scale and the sheer velocity of the market sell-off we are witnessing, it is entirely disproportionate to a loss of 92,000 jobs. An 800-point drop is the market pricing in the catastrophic threat of $150 oil and the resulting destruction of global supply chains.
But you cannot divorce the market's reaction to $150 oil from the domestic environment that the oil is flowing into. That is the missing piece in your analysis of the market's behavior. Think about it practically. If the U.S. labor market were adding 250,000 jobs a month right now, and capital markets were flowing freely to innovators,
I think calling $150 oil a painful headwind severely understates the physics of the global economy. Chuckles. It does not matter how strong your domestic baseline is. We need to look closely at the scale of this energy shock versus the sector-specific contractions you are focused on. Let's detail the physical reality here. Iraq has actively reduced its output due to export challenges. Kuwait is deliberately cutting production at key oil fields. And Iranian exports have effectively stopped altogether.
Which is a significant disruption to regional supply, I agree.
It is more than significant. It is a historic physical bottleneck. This isn't a minor pricing fluctuation where consumers just pay a few cents more at the pump and complain about it. This forces immense inflationary pressures onto every single global sector simultaneously. Energy is the foundational input for all physical goods and logistics. If you manufacture a product, package a product, or ship a product across an ocean, your operating costs just exploded overnight. No domestic economy, no matter how structurally sound, can absorb the simultaneous loss of Iraqi, Kuwaiti, and Iranian output without severe market dislocation. It fundamentally rewrites economic forecasts across the board.
I have to stop you there because the energy bottleneck simply doesn't explain what is happening in places like Silicon Valley. If we pivot to the tech sector data, a completely different narrative emerges, and that has absolutely nothing to do with oil tankers in the Gulf. Tech companies are shedding thousands of jobs right now. That contraction is driven by a lack of venture funding and fundamental shifts in consumer behavior, not the price of gasoline.
But venture funding is entirely tied to macroeconomics and inflation.
It is tied to liquidity. Software engineers aren't losing their jobs because maritime shipping through the Strait of Hormuz is blocked. They don't rely on physical supply chains in the same way manufacturing does. The tech sector was the engine of easy money over the last decade. Its current crash is the canary in the coal mine for systemic liquidity. When a sector that drove a massive portion of all recent U.S. economic growth contracts to levels we haven't seen since 2008, it indicates a deep structural capital market issue.
And how would you define that structural issue?
It means liquidity is drying up entirely. The era of 0% interest rates has ended, and companies that cannot survive on their own fundamentals are finally being exposed to market realities. That is a systemic domestic crisis. It is capital exhaustion, pure and simple, not an energy logistics problem.
You are isolating the tech sector from the broader macroeconomic environment, though. Why exactly is venture funding drying up? Venture capitalists didn't just wake up and decide they hate software. The funding is drying up because inflation expectations are rising, which directly impacts the cost of capital. Lenders and investors demand higher returns when inflation threatens to eat into their profits. And what is currently driving inflation expectations to historic highs?
You are going to say the geopolitical supply shock.
Because it is the undeniable math of the situation. The unprecedented geopolitical supply shock drives up energy, which drives up inflation, which drives up interest rates. The tech sector is incredibly sensitive to interest rates, as you pointed out. But interest rates are currently being held hostage by energy-driven inflation. Therefore, the sector-specific contractions you are pointing to aren't the root cause at all. They are secondary symptoms of the primary geopolitical disease.
Even if I accept that chain of logic, it still proves my point. The fact that the tech sector is collapsing because interest rates might tick up slightly to fight inflation shows how over-leveraged and fragile those companies were to begin with.
Let's look at how global leaders are reacting, because they clearly view this as an energy-driven crisis that requires an energy-driven solution. We are seeing active policy interventions designed specifically to address this external supply root cause.
You are referring to the emergency group of 7, the G7 discussions over the weekend.
Right. There are ongoing high-level discussions among G7 nations right now to tap emergency oil reserves, including the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or the SPR. They are coordinating to stabilize global supply and demand. The logic is incredibly sound, because the root cause is a geopolitical supply issue. Coordinated geopolitical policy can solve it. Flood the market with reserves, stabilize the price of oil, and you stabilize the broader economy. It relieves the exact pressure on inflation, capital markets, and interest rates that you are describing.
That sounds great in theory, but we have to look at the actual efficacy of those policy interventions. Industrial experts and energy analysts express deep, persistent skepticism that tapping emergency reserves will make prices fall significantly. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is exactly what it sounds like, a reserve meant for short-term, acute emergencies. It is a temporary Band-Aid. It is absolutely not a structural solution to the prolonged loss of millions of barrels of daily Gulf production.
But it bridges the gap until the military situation stabilizes.
A very short gap. And if these energy interventions fail, which many experts predict they will, given the sheer scale and potential duration of the conflict, the underlying weakness in employment that we saw in February is going to trigger true stagflation.
And stagflation is the ultimate fear driving market behavior here.
Exactly. For the listener who might not live in economic theory every day, stagflation is that toxic worst-case scenario mix. It is stagnant economic growth, meaning job losses and corporate contraction, paired simultaneously with runaway inflation. It is the nightmare scenario because central banks become completely paralyzed. Normally, if an economy loses 92,000 jobs, the central bank lowers interest rates to make borrowing cheaper and stimulate the economy.
But in a stagflation environment, they lose that tool completely.
Precisely. They cannot lower interest rates to stimulate the tech sector or save those jobs because the energy-driven inflation remains far too high. Lowering rates would just pour gasoline on the inflation fire. It's a terrifying bind for policymakers. And the fact that the G7 is scrambling to release emergency reserves only highlights how fragile the domestic economic situation is right now. Policymakers know the economy cannot withstand this external shock, precisely because of the pre-existing domestic weakness I've been talking about. They are desperately trying to lower the price of oil because they know the internal structural pillars of the economy are already cracked.
I still think that line of reasoning underestimates the sheer power of global realignment. You paint a picture of domestic paralysis, but what we are actually witnessing on a macro level is a fundamental restructuring of the global energy security apparatus. The crisis is forcing a permanent realignment of global trade.
How so?
The trade routes will eventually normalize once the conflict ends.
Not necessarily. Look at the broader geopolitical moves happening in the background of the immediate conflict. We have news reports detailing Russia's strategic pivot to Asian markets, permanently altering European supply lines. We are seeing their active intelligence sharing with Iran to target U.S. forces and shipping. The market isn't just reacting to a temporary supply dip. It is accurately pricing in a long-term structural shift in how global trade and energy security will operate for the next decade.
You think this is a permanent fracture?
I do. This is a profound geopolitical phenomenon. It is not a symptom of U.S. domestic capital market exhaustion. The Dow's 800-point reaction is a rational calculation of the cost of this new global iron curtain in energy markets. It is the realization that the geopolitical order that guaranteed cheap, reliable energy, the very order that allowed globalization to flourish, is fracturing before our eyes.
I absolutely concede that global trade is realigning. The geopolitical map is being aggressively redrawn. There is no question about that. but I look at that exact same reality and use it to reinforce my thesis. The very fact that the United States and European economies are so severely and immediately threatened by these international realignments proves that their underlying domestic economic resilience was vastly overstated to begin with.
Because you think a strong economy could just shrug off a redrawn geopolitical map and the loss of 20% of global oil?
Jekyll's. I think a structurally sound economy, one driven by high domestic employment, robust domestic manufacturing, and a thriving, well-capitalized innovation sector, would certainly feel the sting. But a shift in Russian or Iranian trade routes would not prompt fears of an immediate, devastating domestic recession. The panic we are seeing on Wall Street, the worst week on the Dow since April, is the panic of an over-leveraged, underemployed system realizing that its primary crutch has been kicked away.
And you define cheap foreign energy as that primary crutch.
Precisely. The domestic economy has relied on cheap money and cheap energy to mask its structural flaws for years. We stopped innovating on fundamentals and started optimizing for low interest rates. The geopolitical shock didn't break the economy. It merely exposed that the economy was already broken.
When you look at the sheer scale of what is happening in the Middle East, it is hard for me to see anything else as the primary driver of this crisis. We're talking about the fundamental rewiring of global energy infrastructure, the threat of oil reaching $150 a barrel, the physical halting of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, and the potential loss of massive Gulf production are historic external shocks. The market's 800-point drop aligns precisely with the expansion of military targets and the realization that global supply chains are fundamentally threatened.
But the domestic data simply cannot be ignored.
While domestic factors always play a role, no economy on Earth can absorb a shock of this magnitude without severe dislocation. The primary force rewriting economic forecasts today, driving inflation expectations, and crushing capital markets is entirely geopolitical.
And yet, I keep coming back to the internal numbers, the 92,000 lost jobs in February, and the severe tech sector contraction plummeting to 2008 levels, provide empirical proof that the economy was already on a downward trajectory before this geopolitical crisis hit its current peak. The timeline clearly shows domestic employment and capital markets fracturing first.
You see the conflict as entirely secondary to the domestic story?
The Middle East conflict is a severe catalyst, undoubtedly. But it is ultimately just pulling the curtain back on the vulnerabilities of an economy that was already struggling with systemic weaknesses, a shrinking labor force, and structural capital exhaustion. The rot was already there.
Well, despite our different frameworks for how we arrived at this moment, there is a clear point of convergence in our analysis today. We both agree that the global economy is entering a highly volatile and deeply dangerous period. The stagflation risks are severe and highly credible. The data points from both the domestic labor market and international shipping all indicate a very rocky path forward for both labor markets and consumer prices.
Yes. Our continued disagreement fundamentally rests on the solution. Will solving the geopolitical energy crisis, say if the G7 Strategic Petroleum Reserve interventions are wildly successful and a ceasefire is reached, be enough to correct the economic trajectory? Or is the domestic rot too deep to be fixed by merely lowering the price of a barrel of oil?
That is the billion-dollar question, and it reflects the immense value of examining economic crises through multiple lenses. By simultaneously analyzing domestic structural data and international geopolitical events, we gain a much clearer, more nuanced picture of the interconnected risks ahead. As the G7 considers its coordinated response, and as the military operations unfold over the coming weeks, there will be much more data to monitor and explore. We leave it to the listener to weigh the evidence and form their own conclusion regarding the true root of this economic turbulence.
That's it for today's Artificially Informed.
Nope. Thanks for spending your time with us.
Yeah.
Stay sharp, stay curious. See you next time.